Thank you very much for such a lovely welcome, and it's incredible to be invited to be here so soon after the Chineke Orchestra were here in August to give a concert, and I was very excited that I was able to return to this wonderful city and wonderful building. So thank you very much. It's funny because when I was being set up this morning for the sound system, etc., there wasn't much of a choice of the headset for me, and I said, "Oh, could I have one that matches my skin tone?" But it didn't exist, and so, and it's something that I'm still used to, but it's something that we always have to just bear in mind when, you know, it's just an interesting thing that we don't all look the same. And if we're aiming to try to match skin tones, then we need to think about these things as well. Okay, let's go. I did not become an activist. I was born an activist. It must have been the result of the wonderful combination of my parents. I'm the eldest of 5 children. That might seem like quite a few these days, but back then it was pretty average. My parents came from very different places. My mother was from Southern Ireland, and my father from the Igbo region of the southeastern of Nigeria. Needless to say, theirs was a controversial match. My mother's family practically disowned her, and they both faced terrible discrimination as an interracial couple, living in the days when it was normal to see the infamous "no blacks, no dogs, no Irish" signs posted outside boarding houses. They were pioneers and very liberated for their generation when they met in the early 1950s in London. It was love at first sight, and they remained together for the rest of their lives. My father, a black Nigerian from a relatively comfortable rural background, formerly known as Biafra, and my white Southern Irish mother from a poverty-stricken background in rural County Limerick. They were worlds apart in so many ways, and the likelihood of them meeting must have been extremely rare. Some things they did share was that both of their countries were former British colonies, and neither of them possessed the slightest inkling of entitlement. This is something that they've passed on to all 5 of their children. I think most of us look up to our parents, first of all with unconditional love as a child, and then with admiration when we become parents ourselves, and we realize what it takes to raise a family. But in saying that, I really am in awe of my parents. Their love for each other reached across the boundaries of race, color, religion, and culture at a time when it was frowned on to many outside of your social class, let alone anything else. I had a mixed heritage family of my own decades later. Culturally, things had moved on a bit by that point, but not so much that it didn't make me appreciate the challenge that my parents had faced. It's experiencing some of the challenges they faced is enough to make any child have a sense of justice and the need to make some kind of impact on the world around you. My parents were vindicated by history, but it must have been very difficult for them at the time. As a result, they could have easily closed themselves and their family off from the whole world, but they didn't. In fact, quite the opposite. They raised me and my siblings to follow our passions, to believe in ourselves, and to engage with the world. They never doubted us for a moment, and they made sure we knew that we had to work harder than our white friends and peers in order to receive the same acceptance, recognition, and jobs. Growing up as a mixed heritage child in the 1960s and 70s was not something to complain about or resent. It was simply a fact of life. And like most of our friends, we just got on with the business of enjoying everything that life threw at us. and proving ourselves to society at large. I think my activism must have begun in the womb, because for as far as my living memory allows, I've always felt an overwhelming sense of justice. I would typically worry incessantly when I observed people being treated unfairly for no good reason. And I can remember how these thoughts kept me awake at night, even when I was as young as 6 or 7 years old. I would find myself wondering what I could possibly do to put things right, almost as though these injustices were my responsibility to correct for the sheer reason that I was aware of them in the first place. My family moved from London when I was 6. And as a mixed heritage family, the only black family in the area where we lived outside Canterbury, sometimes we also faced racial hatred and a number of incidents until open racism was declared illegal in the UK. This is not to say that racism miraculously went away after the Race Relations Act in 1965. It just became more covert. I vividly remember an incredible incident when I was 7 years old. It was during the time when a black man could be accused of anything against a white person and they would never stand a chance of a fair trial. This was only 8 years after the savagely brutal lynching and murder of the 14-year-old black boy named Emmett Till in the USA, who allegedly flirted with a white woman. My brother and I were walking with my dad through the centre of Canterbury. My brother Gus was on the other side of Dad, who was holding each of our hands. A white lady with her children, around the same age as us, 6 and 7, was walking towards us. And we ended up doing that kind of dance when you each try to move to one side to let the other person pass. Soon, however, it became very clear that each time my dad stepped to one side to let them pass, the lady stepped to the same side, as if to actually block us. Eventually, with disbelief on realizing what she was up to, my trusting dad just simply stopped. He stopped trying to make way for her. We just stood there calmly. She was then able to deliver what she'd intended to do. She stood face to face with us and simply unleashed a barrage of racist insults. I was absolutely terrified because I had no idea why this was happening and how it would all end. Dad sensed my fear and he gently squeezed my hand a little bit tighter as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got this." In those days, there was little or nothing that a black man could do to defend himself against a white woman's accusations, regardless of whether he was innocent or not. So my dad calmly waited for her to finish. She obviously wanted a fight for some reason, and she knew that she was within her rights to behave like this. When she eventually stopped, my father very calmly looked at her and said 3 words: "I pity you." I had never felt more proud in my life. When many years later I heard Barack and Michelle Obama utter the phrase, "When they go low, we go high," I knew I'd already seen and heard it all before. My father epitomized this to us and taught us to recognize the ugliness of racism, and that when people treat you in a derogatory way, that we should never respond by going down to their level, but by calmly going higher. Another conversation I'd had with my father a couple of years later, in the late 60s. At the time, he was trying to go back to Nigeria to help his Biafran people during the Nigerian-Biafra civil war. He said that if anything happened to him, then my younger brother would become the head of the family. As the eldest of 5 children, with 2 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters, I obviously took umbrage with this suggestion, and I challenged him. Surely my mother's status should be above my brother's and mine, being a year older than that first brother. I think I was clearly also a feminist ahead of my time. I reminded my dad that not only could I run faster than my younger brother, but I also equaled him academically. I was so determined and persuasive in that argument that I completely won him round, and he never again doubted, questioned, or challenged me in anything regarding what I, as a female, could or couldn't do. This was a clear part of my early activism training. We were a lively quintet of children, and I, in particular, always had more than my fair share of energy. If I was that 6-year-old today, I think I would have been given the ADHD tablets from the teachers at school, as I was literally that child who was bouncing off the walls in my classroom. I was fascinated by everything going on inside and outside the classroom, and the day the teacher said, "Who wants to be in?" my hand was up, shot up in the air before she even finished the sentence. The end of the sentence was, "Recorder ensemble." I had no idea what a recorder was, but I knew I wanted to be in it. Music was always a part of my childhood, and it always held a sort of magnetism for me, which is just as well considering the recorder episode. Age 7, a year later, I discovered the piano at a neighboring school friend's house and was instantly drawn to it. I pleaded with my friend's 16-year-old brother to teach me how to play the 12-bar blues that he was playing. He did so in order to satisfy me and get me out of the room. The only trouble was I kept returning to Pamela's house every day to play with her, but the minute I got into the house, all I did was run to the piano and play the piano, and I didn't play with her at all, hammering out the blues over and over again. Eventually, they wheeled the piano up the road and gave it to me as a gift. It was a polite way to say I'd outstayed my welcome. A week later, I began piano lessons, my parents having to work overtime to help pay for my lessons. From stories like this, it might seem inevitable that I became a musician, but the truth is that although I loved music, my burning passion was for athletics. Sprinting in particular was my way of proving myself, and if I do say so myself, I was good at it. Aged 8, I was spotted by a talent scout, and by my late teens was competing over the 100 meters at national level. Just going off script slightly, when I was 16, I almost qualified for Munich Olympics, and I'll come back to that later. Running was my life in those days, and it was on the track that I honed the skills of hard work and perseverance that would stand me in good stead for the years to come. And I would need those skills because, of course, I did not become a professional sprinter. When I was 17 and a half, I sustained a career-ending injury while playing football, and that was that. But every cloud has a silver lining, as they say, and the day I returned to school after 2 weeks in hospital for my knee surgery, my music teacher, knowing that there was a shortage of good double bassists in the country at the time, suggested that I learn to play the double bass. Not just as a hobby or as a distraction from my injury, but seriously, with a view to becoming a professional musician. Let's face it, not many people who are 5 foot tall naturally gravitate towards the contrabass. It turned out that this was exactly the challenge I needed, and all that discipline and work ethic learned during my time in athletics was an enormous advantage to me, and I graduated from the Royal Academy of Music with Petracchi in Rome, ready for a professional career as a double bassist. The rest, as they say, is history. So what's the problem then? All my adult life, I've been a musician. For 35 years, I'd been performing at the most prestigious concert venues around the world. But due to being extremely conscious of certain ways of the world since childhood, I was not deterred knowing that I was in a tiny minority of black musicians working within the classical music industry. As far as I was concerned, I was happily doing my job, the work I loved, performing music. Over the years, some people made that exact point to me, that I was one of very few black classical musicians that they regularly saw on the concert platform. For the vast majority of my career, those comments made no impact on me at all. Perhaps I was in denial. Perhaps it was because I was so busy with my career and raising my own family, or perhaps it was because race or skin color never bothered me. I'd had a very happy childhood with one black and one white parent, and for me, that was the norm. But I always knew that I had to be ahead of the curve with my playing in order to survive. It was rarely spoken of, but it was always understood. I won my first principal solo contrabass job in a London orchestra in 1984, 3 years after I graduated. So that was until 2014, when I was made aware by Ed Vaizey, the culture minister at the time. He called me into his office in Westminster and wanted to know why I was the only black musician that he regularly saw on the international concert platform. I explained to him that when he saw me walk onto the stage, my only thoughts were about the music. I had never defined myself by the color of my skin. That's what he sees. But being questioned by government and challenged in this way made me think. This was the first time that the reality of the diversity problem in classical music hit me. It hit me really hard. I was shocked. I was also shocked that it was a shock to me. I've lived in London for most of my life, and a brief stroll through the centre of the city tells me that I live in one of the most culturally and ethnically diverse places in the world. So why, I wondered, was that diversity not reflected in our orchestras and audiences? Was there something going on that was acting as a barrier and preventing ethnically diverse groups from producing classical musicians? Why was I the odd one out? A few months later, the Kinshasa Orchestra from the Congo visited London and performed at the Royal Festival Hall. By chance, I ran into Ed Vaizey again on my way from Waterloo Station to this concert, and he invited me to accompany him to the pre-concert reception. The director of music at the South Bank Centre was there to greet us. She was aghast. Not only had they forgotten to invite me to this fancy reception, but the BBC were there filming interviews with renowned musicians, but none of whom who had any knowledge of or any connection with Africa. It had not occurred to anybody to ask a black person their opinion about this landmark concert. Looking back on it, it was almost funny how I turned up, unannounced, uninvited, and burst the bubble. That said, it was a fantastic evening, and although in some pieces the Kinshasa musicians were bolstered by a few British players from the BBC, the Halle, and the National Youth Orchestra, in other pieces they performed entirely on their own, and simply put, they were outstanding. But even more interesting was the audience reaction. They seemed surprised. Why was this, I wondered? Was it perhaps that they were hearing works they expected to hear in a concert hall, to a standard they expected to hear in a concert hall, but by an orchestra they did not expect to see in a concert hall, i.e., they were hearing one thing and seeing another? The Kinshasa musicians were all self-taught and had never had access to the quality of instruments or tuition that we take for granted. Many of them walk miles and miles each way to and from rehearsals. That this orchestra was celebrating its 20th anniversary, having overcome so much adversity, was extraordinary. Despite this, during the performance, I overheard a certain member of the audience trying to take credit for the quality of the performance by describing how their organization alone had brought the Kinshasa musicians up to standard. I found it shocking that anyone, let alone a leader of one of our most respected arts organizations, could belittle and talk down a group who had achieved so much with so little. That was the light bulb moment for me, a fresh moment where my activism caught fire. I came out of that concert determined to change how people viewed black and ethnically diverse classical musicians in the UK. I wanted to turn events like the Kinshasa Orchestra concert from a novelty into something entirely normal. Within 24 hours, I had spoken to leading orchestras, venues, the government, British Council, and conservatoires principals. All were in agreement something needed to be done. It was then that I first started thinking about the idea that would become Chineke. And to begin with, it seemed like a daunting task. I hadn't the first clue about how to put together an organization or charity, but I did have an idea that people of color, like me, have a place at the heart of our orchestras and concert halls. My idea was to form a fully professional orchestra made up of a majority of black and ethnically diverse musicians. The orchestra would stand on its own merits. It would be artistically excellent. It would be able to stand side by side with any other orchestra in the world. For the first time, the orchestra would place black and ethnically diverse musicians in the public eye. For the first time, the musicians themselves would be performing in a professional environment where they were not the minority. For the first time, their ethnicity would not be a barrier or a curiosity. I wanted to create an environment where every last one of them felt they truly belonged, so they could just concentrate on their performance and nothing else. Crucially, there would also be a junior orchestra mentored by players from the professional orchestra. You probably recognize the principal cellist of the junior orchestra. Sheku Kane-Mason was 16 years old, and that was taken during their very first performance. These players the professional players would also act as natural role models for the younger musicians. Thus, we would grow the profile of existing black and ethnically diverse classical musicians in the UK and develop the next generation of musicians at the same time. Setting up Chineke was, and still is, a huge learning curve for me, artistically and organizationally. I had and still have great ambitions for what Chineke would be. The challenge was in making those ambitions a reality with very limited resources, especially in the beginning when it was just me, an arts management colleague who helped as a consultant, and an intern. It was touch and go at several points, but always my own and others' belief in the project saw it through. Jude Kelly, the artistic director of the South Bank at the time, was determined to launch us. And so, 364 days after the Kinshasa Orchestra concert, in September 2015, Chineke launched as Europe's first majority black and ethnically diverse orchestra. Chineke's mission is championing change and celebrating diversity in classical music. And with musicians from over 40 nationalities, the group has a truly international flavor. The Chineke Junior Orchestra launched earlier the same day, supported by the senior players in the way I originally envisioned. They represent the next generation, one in which musicians of color are the norm. Our launch concert at the Queen Elizabeth Hall was a moment I will never forget. the crowd rising to applaud all 62 of us as we walked onto the stage. Following the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, many industries very seriously looked into their culture and ways of thinking and have made huge efforts to try to rectify and improve their contribution to an inclusive society. But unfortunately, some are already thinking, enough is enough, we've done Black Lives Matter now, and they want to return to the way things used to be. Sadly, that doesn't look very different to the way things still look today. In our towns and cities, the crucibles of music education and culture, our population are more diverse than at any time now than in history. But in our orchestras, our opera houses and concert halls, time has largely stood still. No organization has struck gold yet, not even Chineke. But the number one thing that great organizations have done is identified that they have a diversity problem and are completely open about the situation and the need to remedy it. Recognizing the issue is a good first step. But the next step is just as important: action. We know that since Chineke started, UK conservatoires have had 4 times more young people of colour applying. Young people need to be able to watch the BBC proms or concerts here at the Elbphilharmonie and see themselves reflected in the audience, on the stage, and in the music performed. No industry can thrive if it cuts itself off from a large chunk of those who could possibly contribute to it. So, what's causing this problem? Look at your markets. Are you seeing your full potential? These past 7 years have been an awakening for me. I've met so many accomplished conductors, composers, and musicians from culturally diverse backgrounds that I never knew existed. And through all of this, I've discovered for the first time in my life just how deep the well of talent runs in diverse communities. I'm grateful for the career I've enjoyed over the past 3 decades, nearly 4 decades, and been privileged to work with many of the world's finest conductors and orchestras. I can confidently say that we all share a burning passion for the knowledge and belief in music's power to move and influence people, and ultimately its ability to make us better human beings. For me, this has been the guiding principle of my working life, that we share a love for our art, the bond that brings us together. Even though we may come from many different backgrounds, we all want our industry to succeed. The same is true for all of you. I know that without being an activist, most of the positive experiences in my life would never have happened, and it confirms to me the importance of truly being engaged with your environment and the culture around you, in the knowledge that you can make the changes that you would like to see. So, whatever your particular role in your organization is, I would say, worry less about political correctness gone mad. Worry less about upsetting the vocal minority of those who want us to stay in the past. Instead, worry more about the idea that your industry might be missing out on a portion of the population who could greatly contribute to your workforce. Worry more about the lost customers and revenue that you could be making from engaging with the entirety of our diverse population. Because that's certainly what I'm worried about the generation of young people currently growing up without the benefit of a music education, about declining and aging audiences, about the potential for classical music to become an irrelevance within our lifetimes. It doesn't have to be this way. We can change it, we are changing it, and we will change it. For those who still dismiss diversity as tokenistic, I'd like to remind you that diversity raises the bar, it doesn't lower the game. To be included and see yourself represented anywhere and everywhere, be it in a store, a restaurant, or a concert hall, and know that you belong is fundamental. Belonging is a basic human need. Everybody deserves that. In the classical music industry, we have a real problem with diversity. Year after year, we see the same people becoming professional musicians from the same backgrounds and cultures. What we don't see is the wonderful diversity reflected on our stages and audiences. And this is what I've been trying to change with the Chineke Foundation, to show people of all colors that music, classical music, belongs to them as much as anyone else. The same applies to you in any walk of life you might choose. Don't feel that you're not welcome in a job where you might be in a minority. Remember, you have as much of a right to choose your career as anyone else does. And the world would be a much poorer place without male nurses, female engineers, and black classical musicians. So please, don't allow what you see now to limit who you become later. I was asked to talk today about becoming an activist. What I have discovered is that whenever you're challenging the status quo, there are always people for whom things are currently working just fine. And they don't like to give up or change without a fight. Hopefully, that will always take the form of reasonable debate, which I obviously welcome. But sadly, sometimes a little too frequently, it can become nasty, rude, and personal. I try to remind myself that when people with vested interests get really angry, then it probably means that I'm on the right track. Thank you.
Do you want to play something?
1 minute of music.
Yes, of course. Go ahead. Of course, of course, of course.
Thank you very much. So I always think when talking about music, it's always nice to have a bit of music, to, because it's one thing that you can't demonstrate with. So I've got a little, very, very short clip of the Chineke Orchestra playing the encore, a little bit of the first movement that we played as our encore in August at the Elbphilharmonie. It's a bit of the Othello suite by Samuel Coleridge Taylor. Yeah.
Titi, people have been so stunned by your storytelling, incredible, that they didn't send any questions.
Oh.
No, literally. You could hear a needle fall in the room.
Oh.
Everybody has been so concentrated. But we have a question there, so we go for you first. Thank you very much. Amazing to have you here. We are so happy to have you, not on Zoom, but lively here.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your work and your presentation. When it comes to representation in the arts of diverse people, I think it's also crucial to talk about the canon, about the repertoire. It also affects representation of women in music, i.e. like female composers and stuff like that. And I find that there's still lots of work to be done within the arts organizations, but also within the conservatoires. Like 2 years ago, and Andrea, you might remember, we did this project with a young classical orchestra, talking about the non-existent, virtually non-existent females in the composition roles, and so that also affects to other levels of diversity. So I'm wondering, like with your orchestra, how do you tackle the issue of the canon, and do you also work with conservatoires to tackle this issue?
Right, thank you very much. Good question. From day one, we've been committed to every single orchestra concert we play. We include a piece of music, at least one piece of music, by a composer of relative ethnicity. So we opened the very first concert with the Ballade in A minor by Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who was a black, and he was like me, mixed race, black British composer from the 19th, 20th century. The day he started at the Royal College of Music, aged 15, was the same day as Vaughan Williams and Gustav Holst. Vaughan Williams was 18, Holst was 16, Coleridge Taylor was 15. The concert we played last Sunday at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, I included a piece by all three composers. And I felt it was probably the first time that they'd all been together since they met at college 134 years ago. But within 5-6 years, Chinook is only just 7 years old, we've already commissioned 14 new works by living black composers, and we've just launched our first debut album with a new relationship with Decca Records, and it's a Coleridge Taylor album with also a piece by his daughter, Avril Coleridge Taylor, and whose music has never been heard before because none of it's published, none of it's recorded, but you can get the first record. It's most beautiful music. Our next album is all music by Florence Price. And we certainly, we've got our eye on all of that all of the time. So rest assured it's in good hands. But conservatoires are not keeping up with it, but we're encouraging them.
Thank you very much. Other questions, please, first row. Where's the microphone? Oh, thank you very much.
I would like to ask if you could give us some insights in the process of reshaping the platforms of such as stages and concert venues in regards to the Chineke Orchestra.
When you say reshaping, can you define what you mean by that?
Because I find that stages or platforms of classical music as conversational topics as they were yesterday are more traditional, or when it comes to diversity, there was not so much before, and I would like to know what the process was to reshape, basically, that image.
Well, by just doing it. When 7 years ago, when I knew what I was going to do, I could count on one hand how many musicians of colour that I'd ever met or worked with, and 3 of them were opera singers and 2 were viola players. You can't form an orchestra with, Roddy Williams, Willard White, Patricia Rosario, Jane Atkins on viola, who lived in Edinburgh, and Larice Campbell, who'd moved to Florida. So I went underground, because I didn't put a notice up for auditions, because I thought if I saw an invitation to do an audition for an orchestra of colour, majority colour, that had never existed before, would I apply for it? Maybe not. I need to know more about it. So I wrote, first of all, to lots of my soloist friends, because they go to play in different orchestras, and to ask them if they knew anybody, if they'd seen anyone look like me, tell me about them. And I phoned, when I phoned the conservatoires, I asked them to give me, you know, alumni, people who they had been to these conservatoires over the last 40 years. And I literally researched every single person. And then I started discovering the young juniors as well. And I realized I'm going to create 2 orchestras at the same time. And I was told by so many people that this was not going to be possible because, come on, Chichi, classical music is not really your sort of music, is it? That's what I was told many times. And black people who do play classical music are not really very good at it. I mean, this is what we were constantly being told. So I just thought, well, I didn't know, because I didn't know any players, so I thought, is that the truth? So I had to find out for myself. And I discovered the more I looked, the more I found this well of talent runs deep. And we have had, you know, there's been a black influence in classical music since we've just recorded something for the first black Asian consort of voices, Chineke voices, music by Vincente Lusitano, born in 1520. West African Portuguese composer, extraordinary music. That's coming out soon as well. And you know, there's always been an involvement, but we've just been bypassed and stepped over. It's there. We've just got to find it. And now, since the awful murder of George Floyd, you know, it was a catalyst to get other people a bit more woken up. And lots of the orchestras in the UK, the London Symphony, the London Philharmonic, they are contacting us to borrow scores. They want to start discovering this music, and then we're lending the scores, and now they're continuing to find their own music. So it's started to happen, thank goodness. And a lot of our composers are now being commissioned by the BBC and various other orchestras. So it's starting to happen.
But they don't steal your orchestra members yet?
Yes, they've started doing that as well. Oh. And I have been warned that I will be a victim of my own success. But the most important thing is that we keep going. The juniors are they're the future, really. Mm-hmm. But yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question. 5 minutes to go.
Thank you very much. It's so inspiring. I was wondering, I think you also have connection with Sphinx Music in Detroit.
Yes.
And there they have this arts leadership part also, because I was wondering, is there something you do about that too? So it's not only on stage, but also backstage?
Not yet. They are 25 years old. I've been going to Detroit for 15 years, you know, when I first discovered them, and that was walking into that first rehearsal with them, I was just in shock, you know. But no, we're in quite a different level at the moment, and you know, we're not in receipt of this kind of funding that they are either. So a lot of our progress depends on support, and of course we want to get more into that. There's a huge lack of leadership and arts administrators from people of color.
We find on your website where we can support the Chineke?
Yes. There should be a button that's click.
If not, if there's none, you will do it tomorrow, I'm totally sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so very much. We are running out of time. Very last quick question.
Anything from this?
This is an incredible success story, and we can imagine this is going on and on and on. You're like embracing the future change. In one short sentence, what is the biggest challenge you're facing in the moment talking about change?
I think
making it short.
Yeah. You see, I'm not known for my sound bites. That's why I have to write things down. Otherwise, I will talk for 3 hours. That's the problem. The biggest challenge about challenge regarding change.
Yeah, regarding change.
I think it's you know at the moment a lot of our audience. Well, it depends where we're playing, but people. Change is never easy, and people cling on to what they know about, and it's just about, you know, we just want people to understand that we're not here to take anything away from people. And I know a lot of the resistance we had from other orchestras and other professionals, they were terrified about the new kid on the block, that we were coming to take their jobs and things like that. No, we're here to amplify the industry, amplify with new music that's been around for 400 years that people don't play, and just to amplify. In fact, we've created more jobs, because players from the LSO, the LPO, the Philharmonia, the BBC, they're all saying, Chichi, can I come and play with Chideke? So we demonstrate that inclusion works. It doesn't just look good, it sounds good. And so and I think we're gradually getting through to people on that. I told you it wasn't going to be short.
Chichi, we are celebrating you, having you here. Thank you so incredibly very much. Thank you. And thanks to your great team behind.